We have Dr. Wilmer Leon, who was with us earlier, and we also have Mr. Stanley Nelson, who is a wonderful documentary filmmaker, MacArthur Fellow. He has a presidential award from President Obama, Emmys, you name it. I've been fortunate to view many of his documentaries, and we're really glad to have you both here with us again.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be back, and it's truly an honor. I get to say, Mr. Nelson, good evening and welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you.
As an American documentarian and a historian, talk about your focus on examining the African American history and the African American experience.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we do and we feel at Firelight Films and Firelight Media, which is our company, is that people should tell our own story, and that, part of my story is the African American experience. That was what I grew up in, what I know deeply, and those are the stories that I've been fortunate enough to tell, and I'm very honored to tell. And there's so many more stories to tell. So there's a lot of work ahead.
How does this narrative impact and shape our perception of reality?
Well, I mean, I think that, history has for the longest time in this country has been told by, one group of people. Believe it or not, I'm kind of in the first generation of African American BIPOC filmmakers, documentary filmmakers. So, when I was growing up, we didn't see films by and about us. We saw very few films about us and no films by us. So the history is being told in a different way. A lot of times I compare it to, like if you're diving in the pool of history, so you're diving in this pool of African American history, and somebody coming from outside it, can dive, and skim across the water on the top, but they can't go deep. They didn't have my grandmother and my grandfather, in working on a film a few years ago, I found an obituary of my great grandfather, my father's father, and my father's grandfather, I'm sorry. And it said born a slave, born a slave in 1860, and that is part of my history, that, my great grandfather was a slave, and so that, it's very different for me when I'm working on films about, my history. Also, I think it means more to the people that I'm working with. We work with a lot of African American, editors, associate producers. We were making a film on the Black Panther Party, and I had to go out to
phenomenal film, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I had to go out to talk, and I came back at 9 o'clock at night, and they were still in the office. And because it's part of their history, and we realize that it's a real gift to be able to tell that history. So that's one of the things that I stand for, and not to kind of give anybody an opportunity so much as just make better and deeper films, better and deeper history, because we can go deep into the history.
How much of this debate about our history, especially within our own community, is generational? And I ask that because you're about 6 years older than I am, and I remember when Dr. King was assassinated. I remember John Carlos and Tommy Smith in Mexico. That was real for me. It's not theoretical. It's not, it was real. So how much of this, and I remember in an interview you did about the Attica film, you were talking about, you remember when that happened. And I remember when that happened. So talk about it from a generational perspective.
Yeah, I think that that the one thing that we have to understand, and is that you know time passes in different ways when you're different age. So Attica was 50 years ago, right? So Attica was in 71, 1971, and so that was a little over 50 years ago. Well, if you go back 50 years from there, you're talking about 1921. And so that really seems old. So so young
And
people in
there
the late.
you're talking about now you're around the time of Tulsa, and you're around the time of the Red Summer.
Right, but you're also around the time where the airplane was invented, and cars were
Right.
invented, and movie cameras. So it's a very different thing. I was born in '51, and in many ways, we were still living with World War II. World War II had just ended. But World War II is like there's hardly anybody left alive, who fought in World War II. And so it's just different for younger people. But I think that if you tell history, history is exciting, and if you tell it in certain ways, the history can be very exciting. When we did Freedom Riders, we looked at it like an adventure story. It was like an adventure, and certainly the Black Panthers is an adventure story. Attica
That takes me to my next question in terms of your approach. I'm glad you talked about framing the Panthers as an adventure story. I grew up in California. I remember the Panthers in Oakland during the 60s. And adventure is a very good way to describe that. So talk about your approach to these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we have to do in making a film is, we have to keep in the back of our mind, that dirty little word, that these are also entertainments, that they are also entertainment. So we want to, not only be as rigorous, historically as we possibly can. And we've never been, had to change anything in our films, but we also want, you're spending time, watching a film. And so that we want it to be in many wain to move in a certain way, to entertain you, and again, I when I say, I almost like cringe at the word, because most people are like, oh no, but one of the things that we have to do as filmmakers is to make it something that you want to watch. And it's like it's a popular history, and hopefully it can drive people to now read books and to, because the film is not a book. I always say in a film it's like we can give you about as much information as you can give an introduction of a book. Like in the first chapter of the book, that's about as much information as we can give you in a 2-hour film.
So as you talk about films such as Attica, and you talk about the Panthers, and you talk about the Freedom Rider film, in the current context of where we are and why we are here, what's happening in Florida, the attack on history, what's happening in Virginia with the attack on history, how make what we've just been talking about relevant to this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we have to understand, and I try to say it whenever I get a platform to say it, these are not normal times. This is not normal, and we just have to keep that in mind. I mean, if you told us, 20, 30, even 10 years ago that we'd be burning books, that books would be banned, that history would be banned, we would have said, you're crazy, like not in this country. So I think that it's extraordinary times, and we all have to fight it. I mean, it's really one of the things that people try to do is to erase history. and change history. If you can erase history, then you can do whatever you want. And this country has just really started to look at its history, and I
Mhm.
think that it's only a good thing. It's only a good thing if you look at your history in the clear light of day. It's not I can't think of anything that's bad about it. And we have to understand that, um, there's nobody in this country that was an enslaver of African Americans. We're not accusing anybody of anything,
Mhm.
and but just like my great grandfather was a slave. I mean, that's the truth. And other people were enslavers, and we have to talk about that time and understand that.
And it's interesting that you talk about your great grandfather being enslaved. My grandfather was not enslaved, but he was born on the Devore plantation in Greenwood, South Carolina. And I tell my students all the time, that means I'm at now 64, I'm 3 generations removed. I knew that guy. I remember that guy. This is not some vague philosophical figure. He was a real person. And what I think gets lost many times is that direct connection, because we see it as so theoretical as opposed to being real.
Yeah, and I think the more we learn and understand history, and the more history is shown and taught, and we see history, and we're moved by it, and the more it will become real. And I don't think you have to have a direct connection. So I say my great grandfather was a slave. I tell my kids, well, their great great grandfather was enslaved. And all through the generations. That's our history, and I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud to be a filmmaker today. I would hope that my great grandfather would be proud of me as I'm proud of him, because he survived, and only because he survived am I here, and are we here for all our ancestors who went through this horrible time.
And that's really an important part that oftentimes gets overlooked, is the fact that it's an incredibly empowering story, because it is about survival. It is, yes, about oppression, but it's also about overcoming that oppression. And I think that element gets lost a lot of times in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's heroes, of every story, of our stories throughout history. The Freedom Riders were incredibly, brave, and in some ways, did something that was unimaginable.
Mm-hmm.
Emmett Till's people who stood up, and testified in open court, were incredibly brave. So that within the tragedy and within the suffering, there's always heroes, and always happiness too. And our history is not one of of sadness and misery and deprivation. That's not the history I know. I mean, my people are very joyous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As you can hear in our music, which is the soundtrack to our history.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, because you did a piece on Miles, which
Yeah.
which was phenomenal, phenomenal work. As we're down here in Florida, and we look at what the DeSantis administration is trying to do in terms of removing African American studies from AP history courses, not only then is the governor erasing the history, the governor is erasing us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that looking, at what's happening in Florida from the outside, I mean, it's almost unimaginable. And we have to understand that, and that everybody has to do what they can to fight. If you look at fascist regimes, it's always like small increments. You take away something, you take away something, you take away something. As they say, you came for somebody, and then you came for somebody else, and then finally you came for me.
And when you came for me, there was nobody left.
Right. So we've got to fight, now, and continue to fight.
What's the next project?
We're doing a bunch of things. I'm actually down at the PBS meeting in San Diego, California right now, and we just
Lucky
presented
you.
a little piece. Yeah, well, no, it's actually the weather has been freezing cold.
But you're still in San Diego.
Yeah, it's cold. It's cold and rainy for the 3 days. But we're doing a piece on funk music. And so it's just kind of fun, kind of a real fun piece. And
where are you starting in terms of your history of funk? Are you going to James Brown and the Famous Flames? Where are you starting?
Yeah.
Where are you starting to move? The groove. Where are you starting the groove?
So much of it starts with James Brown, in this country. But it goes back to Africa. It goes back, to the beat and trying to, music to get people up and dancing. As somebody says in the little trailer that we just did, there's no sad funk songs. There's no sad funk songs. It's all about transcendence and being happy that you're alive.
As James Brown said, it's always about the one. It's about being, and I say, Stanley Nelson, you are definitely on the one. My brother, thank you.
Well, that's one of the best compliments I've ever gotten in my life. So thank you so
much. Stanley Nelson, American historian, documentarian, director. Just really quickly, as a director, what do you see as a director being the major challenge of telling stories regarding our history?
Money. I mean, it's money. It's money, and then telling stories that are honest, that where the filmmaker is being 100% honest about and not pulling any punches. We have a film that's coming out now in a couple of months called Sound of the Police, about the history of police violence, dating back to slave catchers, to lynchings, and coming up to the present day. So and it's a rough film, and we wanted it to be rough. We didn't want it to be that the police are good but they're bad, but they're good but they're bad. No, they're bad.
And that when you don't follow the history, then it's very easy to miss that incredibly salient and valuable point.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really important that we understand the history so that we can change. I mean, if the police were there as slave catchers and there to kind of condone lynchings and things like that, then we know that, and we can say, okay, how do we go forward? How do we change policing so that it serves everybody, so that it serves minority communities, and it's not in opposition to minority communities? It's important that we know the history so that we change.
Stanley Nelson, American documentary filmmaker, director, writer, producer. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. Look forward to the next film.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Leon, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Thank you for that interview. I would have thought maybe I'd ask you a couple questions. We could just talk a little bit about you're there on the ground.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, you have to submit all your questions in writing, and okay. I'll respond within 30 days.
That's still pretty good. 30 days. That's still pretty good. Okay.
What you got?
Yeah. So what is kind of your impression of the kind of energy and the folks who are there in the church, in the sanctuary, or in the hall with you now, as well as kind of just your sensibility of people's kind of gravity, the way they're feeling that these really draconian laws that have been passed?
Well, in terms of the sense in the space, the energy is incredible. The presenters, and if I may be biased, being one of them, the presenters have been on point, have been on track, have been incredibly engaging, and I have gotten that, and I see nods of affirmation in front of me.
Okay.
So folks haven't had any trouble staying awake. So the energy is good because the presentations are capturing people's interest and attention. I'm sorry, and what was the second part of the question? The draconian nature of the.
Well, I saw your presentation right at the beginning. Okay. And I was like, this guy is hitting all these pieces. You're quoting, Wallace, you're going back before that in time. You're hitting the highlights of the lowlights. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how your sensibility of like there being there in the midst of a very pointed set of critiques and concerns that are being leveled just in the last 4 hours or so. Like how you're kind of feeling that is connecting to the larger sense of what you're hearing from a pastor or from congregants or from anybody you might have talked to in the area.
Oh, I think it's connecting directly. And because I've said this, Pastor said this, Uhuru has said this, Terry, we are in the moment. And in so many instances, you don't realize it at that time. You're going through your daily lives, you're doing what you do, and then time passes, it becomes history, and then you look back and say, wow, I was there at that time. I didn't realize that it was going to be what it wound up being. Well, here we are right now, and because we are connecting the dots. One of the things that I say on my radio show all the time is one of the big mistakes that a lot of people make in their analysis is they have a tendency to think that things happen in a vacuum. And they don't understand the interrelatedness between events. That's one of the reasons why history is so important. You've got to connect the dots. DeSantis didn't just wake up last week and decide this is what he's going to do. If you look at his family history, if you look at Greg Abbott's family history out of Texas, you will see this is what these people do. And so you have to deal with them in that manner. This is not a one-off here. Yeah. This is not this. Folks will say, how can this happen in America? Well, the answer is very simple. This is America. This is what America does. And if this, as Gil Scott-Heron says, America, the international Jekyll and Hyde, the land of 1,000 disguises, it sneaks up on you but rarely surprises. And that's exactly where we are. So I think we here are doing a very good job of connecting the dots and taking the current moment and having people clearly understand they are in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for being
my pleasure
there.
All right.
Hosting. Thank you. Good night. We'll see you soon later,
See you soon.
I'm sure.
All right. You got it.